Hi, everybody. Joining us for the first armor lecture of this fall. It's really nice to be back. I want to start off our lecture, as always, with a land acknowledgement first. I want to acknowledge that the Field Museum was built within the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, as well as the Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, Meskwaki, Sauk, the Illini Confederacy, Menominee, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Iowa's, Odawa, Missouri, and Miami nations. Chicago was and continues to be an important place of trade, worship, and interaction for many diverse peoples. And it's important that we remember that this land was and remains native land. So now I'm very excited to kick off this fall series with a talk from Dr. Dave Lunt. He's an associate professor of history at Southern Utah University, and his research focuses on the history of athletics in ancient Greece. He's native to Salt Lake City, Utah, and earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from history from the University of Utah, and earned his PhD in ancient history from Penn State. Dr. Lunt is fluent in Latin and Greek and has traveled throughout Greece and Italy while studying the ways in which ancient and modern athletics reflect and interact with society, religion, culture, politics, and mythology. I lost my spot. Along with his studies of athletics, Dr. Lunt has also published on the campaigns of Alexander the Great and the myth of Prometheus. His book, The Crown Games of Ancient Greece, Archaeology, Athletes, and Heroes, was published in 2022 and is available at our own library if anybody wants to check it out. At Southern Utah University, Dr. Lunt offers a variety of classes on ancient Greece, sports, and human history, and I have it on good accord from one of our own Field Museum staff members that he is an incredible instructor and mentor. So please join me now in a warm welcome to Dr. Dave Lunt.
That's a lot of clapping for someone who hasn't talked yet. So thank you. I appreciate it. I'm so grateful to be here. Some friendly faces in the crowd, and really no unfriendly faces, I guess, so far. But I'm very grateful to the Field Museum and to Stacy and everyone else who made it possible for me to come out here. So I'm going to start us out, and I think I wander around a little, but I want to stand in mostly one place because, in case it's being recorded like the other ones. But if I look uncomfortable, I'm trying not to be, but I'm kind of generally a wanderer in my life. But I want to start this out today just talking about the Olympics as a touchstone, right? A cultural touchstone. Last month in 2024, the people of France welcomed the world to Paris for the Olympic Games, or if we're going to use their terminology, for the Games of the 33rd Olympiad. You have to say it in a deeper voice than I have. But somewhere around 10,000 athletes from over 200 countries, along with thousands of spectators and coaches, officials, dignitaries, support staff, sponsors, and of course, millions of people on television, spent about 2 weeks watching the world's finest athletes compete for Olympic glory. And most of us have heard that the Olympic Games and the Olympic movement, it derives from the ancient Greek festival to Zeus that was held in a place called Olympia in southern Greece. And our perceptions, though, of the Olympic Games in ancient times have been heavily influenced by the modern Olympic movement. And there's a lot of interplay between them, but this is what I want to tackle today, right? So the modern Olympic movement has a stated goal to promote peaceful and better world within the spirit of friendship, solidarity, and fair play. And that's awesome, right? Like that's definitely noble and worthwhile. But the ancient Olympic Games were quite different in scope and in nature than today's Olympic program. And added to that, there's more than the games at Olympia. There are 3 other sets of games together as a circuit called the Crown Games, including the every 4 years, the quadrennial games at Olympia. And that's what we're going to talk about today, or at least what I'm going to talk about. And I'll leave some time at the end if you want to ask some questions or go over something. But this is what we should try to tackle today, is what's going on in these Crown Games and how does it connect or compare to the modern movement. And so I want to frame it out just to talk about ancient Greek society in general. Intensely competitive, right? They competed in all sorts of things, not just in athletics, but in speaking and comedy and tragedy, in poetry, right? You could win prizes or be considered the best political discourse or whatever, right? They're always awarding prizes. So very, very competitive. And of course, athletics is an area where that's to do. Every city in ancient Greece had a gymnasium. I know gymnasium's a little different in ancient times than what we think of today, but more or less the same function, a place for people. And in ancient Greece, it's mostly men and boys, right? So it's male oriented. Every city has its gymnasium. We're going to talk mostly about the athletic components of the gymnasium today. And they would have competitions in the city. And if you're really good and you're a strong athlete, well, maybe you could go on to the regional competitions, right? And eventually, of course, the highest level of athletic competition is held at what we call the crown games. So there are 4 places. This is my really awesome, amazing ability at maps. Took me about an hour to learn how to do this, and I'm sorry it's crude, but this is where we are, right? So the 4 crown game sites at Olympia, you can see it there in the Western Peloponnese. This is southern Greece today. Nemea and Isthmia are very close to one another. Isthmia is, as its name suggests, on the Isthmus of Corinth, and then up to the north just a smidge. Delphi, where the Pythian held. And a couple of things I want to make sure that I emphasize right off the bat is these festivals, these athletic competitions are always connected to a religious festival. You could do athletics at home or in your town, like for fun or whatever, but when they're done in this context of the big games, it's always a festival. The prizes at these 4 games, the reason they're called the crown games, because the prize that would be awarded to a victorious athlete, the crown made from some kind of plant or tree or branch, right? At Olympia, of course, it's olive. So, I guess it's connected to a twig. Laurel leaves at Delphi, wild celery at Nemea, and pine at Isthmia. Right? And of course, there are other prizes when you get home or depending on your circumstances, but those were the reason. That's why they're called the crown games. Okay. So the ancient Greek world is pretty big, right? Today you think of Greece, many people, I meet have been to Greece, and it's great, but the modern country of Greece, borders are much smaller than where the ancient Greek people lived. Stretched from what is today southern France, even into Spain, North Africa, especially after Alexander and his armies conquered Egypt. There were even more Greeks in that part of the world. Modern Turkey, especially the coastline, the islands of Aegean, and of course, Greece. After the conquest of the Macedonians in the 4th century, there are Greeks even further east into what is today Afghanistan and Syria, right? So there's a lot of area, but I just showed you the crown games are held in the Greek heartland of Greece today. From the early 500s CE until the 300s of the Common Era, that's about 900 years. The crown games represented the basic standard chronological continuity for the world, right? Greeks, eventually Romans are going to become involved as Rome conquers a big chunk of this world. The games are not immune from disruptions. Things happen, there's upheaval, but more or less, the games are held regularly for over 900 years. And that's pretty significant in human history. I often ask my students, can you think of anything that people have been doing at the same time, the same place for, regularly for that many years? And there are a few things that are hard, especially maybe not where I live in the Western United States, but indigenous cultures especially have things, but it's rare. As the Greek world journeyed, those who could, to these sanctuaries, they could walk in sacred processions, witness animal sacrifices, listen to poetic performances, and of course, watch their society's highest levels of athletic competitions. So the games offer rare opportunities for Greeks to come together. Not all of them could make the journey, but Greeks from all over the Greek-speaking world could come together and exert some kind of unity. During the great festivals, the Crown Games festivals, The sanctuaries would bring in pilgrims and spectators, vendors, athletes, trainers, dignitaries. Olympia had a special building just to host distinguished, fancy VIP visitors. Ordinary Greeks, people probably more like you and I, we had to jostle with one another to find places to camp, to find fresh water, and to navigate peddlers and salespeople trying to sell you souvenirs, right? It was this wild kind of cacophonous extravaganza of, of activity. Okay. So preparing for a festival, about several months before the games would begin, a herald would be sent from the Crown Games sites throughout the Greek world to announce the upcoming games. And that happens regularly. People knew about it. But with the herald's proclamation, they start gathering to place, right? Whether Olympia or Isthmia or Delphi. The heralds would announce that meanwhile, back in the towns, the judges were being selected in the host cities. And maybe I should have mentioned this, but the games themselves are held in sanctuaries that belong to the gods, at least at Olympia, Nemea, and Isthmia. And so there's a city nearby, not walk away, what we would call today the host city, right? Sanctuaries themselves is not where the people live full time. The host city is where people are. Athletes would arrive in these host cities and spend a month training under the eyes of the judges to make sure, people like me didn't just show up and say, yes, I'm a world-class wrestler or whatever, right? And so to make sure only the finest athletes would move on to the competition. They'd also prepare the facilities in Olympic Sanctuary and the other sanctuaries, the Crown Games. And we'll use Olympia as our model because the other cities sanctuary modeled their festivals after those at Olympia. But just keep in mind, more or less, this is what's going on at all four of these places during the regular time. And maybe I should have brought this up. So there are 4 festivals, and I really wanted to, there's one every year, because that would be nice. If you ever wonder why the Olympics are every 4 years, it's not quite that simple, although the Olympics were every 4 years. And the Pythian Games are every 4 years at Delphi, but at Isthmia and Nemea, they're every 2 years, the off year. So there's at least one every year, but some years there are 2. I can show you a chart. It's more complicated than I wanted to, but it's fairly straightforward. So there's at least one of these festivals every year, and the athletes would gather and train under the eye of the judges. And at Olympia, at the time of the second full moon after the summer solstice, so okay, that's usually sometime in August, the large procession would this is the city-state that administered sanctuary at Olympia, and they would make the walk to Olympia. It's about 36 miles as the path meanders. It's not a straight line, right? But the ancient road took a couple of days, and there would presumably be thousands of people, spectators, athletes, their family members, judges, dignitaries, referees, all sorts of people walking to the sanctuary. At the sanctuary, the athletes, along with their male relatives, stand in front of a statue of Zeus and swear an oath to commit no harm to the Olympic Games. That really means don't cheat, right? Do your best. There would be sacrifices and contests, and at night feasts and parties and all sorts of fun. So this is where it took place. This is the ancient Olympic Stadium, the stadium at Olympia. There's not much left. There never was much of an infrastructure here. They don't have seats or grandstands. Well, people always sat on the hillside here. One of the strangest things for us to think about is ancient games were competed in the nude. I remember they're all males. I don't know if that makes a difference, but that's how it is. The word gymnastics actually exercise. It's gymnasium. So let your inner junior high school snicker next time someone talks about going to the gym or whatever, right? So most of these events are held in the stadium. We had running events, right? One distance is about 180 meters, somewhere around 200 yards. We had there are 3 different races in the stadium. One's the one length of the stadium race called the SAD. There's 2 lengths of the stadium, and there's a longer distance one, probably about 3 miles in modern measurement. We also have pentathlon, which include throwing the javelin and long jumping, wrestling and discus throwing and sprinting. Combat sports like boxing and wrestling, another sport called Pancration, similar to mixed martial arts today, with very, very rules, a fight and submission kind of contest. No weight classes, right? No, heavyweight versus lightweight, just big, strong, tough people. There were classes of men and boys, and in some games they had youths, but in general, it was just who one competitor who's going to win. At the Pythian Games in Delphi, they had musical contests, which strikes us perhaps as a little strange in terms of athletics. They also had, at least we have evidence from musical contests in Isthmia and Nemea, although it's a little sparser as evidence. This is what's left of the Temple of Zeus. That column was re-erected in the early 21st century, just to give you a sense of how big it was. Inside this temple, one of the wonders of the ancient world is described by several sources, right? The statue is sculpted by Thetis. And I want you to try to imagine going to this spot during the games, and it would be full of philosophers and rhetoricians, right? Professional speakers, orators, poets, performing, lawyers, demonstrating how good they were at arguing in court, advertising their ideas to the masses, wander through, buy a snack, listen, get into arguments. Or stoas, which are covered walkways with rooms, gift shops selling stuff, while there are sacrifices going on to honor the gods, victory statues everywhere, with some of them with inscriptions describing who won, where, how, treasuries that showed off a city's wealth and fame. They're all jammed into this precinct, and there's just not much left. Banquet rooms and dining facilities uncovered at the sites of the Crown Games suggest very, very lavish feasts and parties, both to honor the people who won, but also to draw attention to the person who was paying for it all, right? The generous host. So we read about this cacophony, this wild cacophony of activity and music and human enterprise throughout the sources, right? And we don't always get that when you wander around an archaeological site today. In the 4th century BCE, the Greek historian Xenophon related, just in passing, this wasn't the bulk of the story, but he relates in passing that during the Olympic Games, the sanctuary, the spot you're looking at in the photo right here, is filled with elaborate temporary booths, right? Like tents at a fair, presumably to shield people from the sun, but also to bring them purchase. So hopefully this commotion, you can get a sense of how it is. Now, I don't have a ton of time, and I want to leave time after. And this is too big of a project to say everything that's ever happened, and it would be a little bit boring, right? Germans anyway, have been digging at Olympia for 150 years. There's a lot there. There's a lot still to uncover. But what I thought I would do is just share a story from each of the Crown Games sites to perhaps illustrate the kinds of things that go on and connect them back to our questions. What goes on at Crown Games festivals, and how does that compare to what went on in France just a month or two ago? So the first story I want to tell is the story of the family of Diagoras of Rhodes, right? And there's a great ancient Greek poet who would write poems for money for great athletes, right? Victorious athletes. His name's Pindar. And Pindar wrote an Olympian ode, right, for Diagoras. He calls him a straight fighting mighty man. It's a pretty good line from Pindar. And Diagoras' family, Diagoras has 3 generations of Olympic champions. Diagoras himself is an Olympic champion in in boxing. And his sons, Akugalaus, Demagatus, and Dorius, won in Pancration, like that fighting, and in boxing, right? Dorius, the youngest, he won Pancration 3 consecutive times at Olympia. So every 4 years, 3 straight times, that's at least 8 years, right? If you win in 4 years, win, 4 years, win. 8 years where he is the dominant, big, strong, tough guy at the games. He won 8 times at Isthmia, 7 at Nemea, and once he won at the Pythian Games by forfeit. Nobody dared fight him, or didn't want. I'm tired of getting beat up by this guy after a month of training. When Akuzalaus and Demagatus, these 2 champions, won, they carried their father, the older former champion, on their shoulders as a throng of admiring flowers, graduates. One admirer supposed to have said, "Go ahead and die now, Diagoras. This is as close as you'll get to Mount Olympus," right? Like, this is the greatest moment we'll ever feel. In other words, right? Parent myself, right? Watching your children is about the best thing you can imagine. So this is the second generation, but there's a third generation of this family from Rhodes. Two of the grandsons of Diagoras are also champions of Olympia. Their names were Oikles and Peisirodas, right? And both of them are in boxing. And the mother of Peisirodas was a woman named Caliptera. Sometimes the different sources call her Pharenice. We're just going to call her Caliptera. Again, through my amazing PowerPoint skills. I know the bar's low, but that's what I'm at. That's what I've got for you. So Caliptera is what I'm going to call her. She is the mother of Peisirodas and this daughter of Diagoras and the sister of those other three champions I was just telling you about. And her husband had died, and she really wanted to watch her son in the championship boxing match. And so she dressed up as the trainer. She disguised herself as a man, snuck into went into and watched as a trainer. And the sources tell us that when her son won, she was so excited she jumped over the barrier, right? Probably like a rope or something, the barrier to keep the spectators out of the boxing area. And she fell, and her clothes must have slipped. There was I think we say wardrobe malfunction. And the source says, I want to get her right. She revealed herself to be a woman. Something showed that identified her as a woman. And there was a law, right? There was a law that if a woman had, I guess we'll say illicitly snuck in, there were a few women that were allowed, priestesses or dignitaries, but a woman had snuck into the proceedings, she was supposed to be thrown off the cliff. It's called Mount Taipeian. It's across the river. That was supposed to be the penalty. But the Olympic judges decided, well, that's a pretty steep penalty for wanting to see your son. And this is just me. This isn't in the sources. This is what I like to believe. Remember, her dad and her brothers and her son were all Olympic fighting champions. This lady is tough, right? I don't want to grab her and throw her off a cliff, like she probably would make herself known. And so instead of punishing her this way, they created a new rule that the trainers had to remove their clothing too. Go and watch the athlete. This is one of the few stories about women that we have. I don't know if we want to see the trainers with their clothes off, or I don't know what that looks. I don't know. I don't even want to think about it. But this is a great story about a great Olympic family. So it's happened here at Olympia. Caliptera. This is Delphi, right? The navel of the world. According to myth, Zeus caused two eagles to be released from the edges of the world and fly towards each other at the same rate, I suppose. I'm not a math major. And they bumped heads, so to speak. They met at Olympia, right? It's the middle, the navel of the world. This is where the Oracle of Apollo was located, one of the most famous and important oracles, not just in the ancient Greek world, but kind of in the ancient world generally. This is where the Pythian Games were held. And so what you're looking at here, it's kind of hard to see because everything is the same kind of grayish brown, but you can see the semicircle of theater, right? And just a little bit to our, I guess we'll say, right, Temple of Apollo. Not much left. French who excavated it kind of placed the column drums back up for a few of those columns. There was another village, the modern village of Delphi was built on top of it. And in the early 20th century, kind of a crazy story. The French paid for this, the French government, and they bought the entire village and moved everybody down the street a couple miles, tore down their houses. And that caused a lot of hurt feelings, a fight or two. That was crazy, but this is what it looks like today. And so this is where the Pythian Games took place. And Apollo is the god of music, right? Musical competitions held in that theater I just showed you. Here, Apollo and this dish is holding a kithara, right? It's like a harp. Sometimes it's called a lyre, like L-Y-R. We also have musical competitions in a woodwind. It's called the aulos. It's a single aulos and double aulos. Aulos, shaped like a V and blow into the going, according to what it looks like in art. And then they were singing to accompany this as well. So several different musical categories of competition at the Panhellenic Games. They also had what we call a gymnastic contest. And I don't think I mentioned this because it's not really part of my talk, but there was a large equestrian program at Delphi and all of the other Crown Game sites too, chariot like this. So Apollo's the god of music. And if you go to Delphi today, if you're lucky enough to get to Delphi, you'll see this building. It's been reconstructed by archaeologists. They're doing their best. They had to put it back together, and it got smashed a couple times in subsequent earthquakes in the 20th century. But on the walls of this building, it's called the Temple of, or the Treasury of the Athenians. On the walls, there are several inscriptions, and these inscriptions are songs or hymns to Apollo. And they tell more or less the same story. And in fact, some of them have notation for music on them, and their scholars think they've cracked the code for how ancient Greek musical notation translates into the way we write today. And you can play this. It's kind of awesome to hear. It's not exactly what our modern aesthetic is from cool sound, I think. But these hymns, the words of these hymns, tell the story of how Apollo came to Delphi. Play this tune, Pythianomos is what it's called. And in one of the competitions, every competitor had to play the exact same song. And that's how they could judge that it wasn't or it had done better to win the crown. And the words of the hymn tell us that Apollo was a new god, right? He's born on the island of Delos, has a twin sister, Artemis. But Apollo's wandering around. He's looking for a place to build his sanctuary, right? He wants a temple, and he's going to have an oracle, all this stuff. This is just a myth, right? So, no, where we're at. And so Apollo's going around, he's investigating it, and he comes to the land in Boeotia, the place in Thebes, and he meets a nymph in this little kind of spring coming out of the ground. It's a beautiful place. And he goes, I think I'm going to have my temple here. And the nymph, her name's Telphusa. She goes, oh, you don't want to do it here. This place is bad. Water gets all muddy when the horses come by and drink. There's a better place at Mount Parnassus, right? Just a little further up into the mountains. This is in fact where Delphi is on Mount Parnassus. She goes, you should check it out. It's amazing. So Apollo goes to check it out, but it was really a trap, right? Because Telphusa didn't want to compete with Apollo for the spring. And there was a monster at Delphi, Python, right? And Python is the name of a snake, right? The word in Greek for snake is the same as the word for dragon. So the snake dragon is what I usually say, or the dragon snake, big scary monster going to eat Apollo, and Telphusa would be rid of her rival for shrine territory back in Ocean. Well, Apollo shows up, and he's Apollo, right? He's not going to let some little, some monster snake eat him. And so he takes out his bow and he shoots the snake and kills it. And because the python was killed on this spot, to commemorate it, this big monster Apollo had done. This is why they're called the Pythians. And so Apollo decided, after all, yeah, I think I'll keep my. Oh, sorry. Apollo is right. I'm trying to do a good job here by you, Apollo. So Apollo kept his sanctuary in Delphi, but now it was safe. And then he did send punishment back for Telphusa, setting him up into that kind of trap. Okay, shifting to Nemea. This is what's left of the sanctuary of Zeus. Many of these columns were re-erected in the 2010s, so not that long ago, but 3 of them have stood the whole time. Cool, there are not that many places in Greece with the columns still standing outside of Athens. But most of the time at Nemea, sanctuary did not host the Nemean Games, right? It's evidence for about archaeologists excavated the site, and they discovered a bunch of stuff that got burned down, and arrows and detritus from a what looks like a war. And so sometime around 420 BC, there seems to have been a battle that destroyed many of the buildings, or maybe afterwards, one destroyed them. We're not really sure. We don't have it in the written sources, but the games were moved to a nearby town called Argos. Right? Argos is still a big city in Greece today. Shows up in a lot of myths. And so Argos hosts the Nemean Games for much of their history. But in 235, a man named Aratus of Sicyon is not too far away, but he has a coalition, he has an army, and he's fighting against Argos. And the time for the Nemean Games rolls around, and Aratus says, well, you're holding the Nemean Games in Argos, as you've done for a couple hundred years. We're going to hold the Nemean Games in Nemea, right? We're going to bring it back, right? So he holds them in Nemea. And Aratus also says, oh, by the way, anybody on their way to Nemea to compete in the games, you're fine. But if you're on your way to Argos, we're going to capture you and sell you as slaves. Pretty fierce, pretty harsh. And that goes against the motto of, peace, this idea of the Olympic truth. But this is what he does. He captures Nemea, ruthlessly punishes anybody traveling to the other version. And the Nemean Games are going on in two places at the same time in 235 BC. You had to be careful which one you were loyal to. Otherwise, your security depended on it. And about 5 years later, the war died down. Aratus made peace. His practice stopped, but a very intense time of bringing back the sanctuary at Nemea. And then our fourth crown game site. There's not much left of Isthmia if you go there today. It's a very important location on the Peloponnese, right as the isthmus goes there. It's a crossroads between Italy and Asia, northern Greece, southern Greece. Ships would put in there. Corinth is kind of in two places on either side of the isthmus, and the Isthmia is right there. So it makes sense that this is where Poseidon worshipped. And our sources indicate there was a lot going on at Isthmia for their festival. It's not just a copy of the games going on at Olympia. We have boat races because there's an ocean nearby. Dramatic contests like comedy, tragedy. We have huge crowds of people mentioned in the sources. And there's a Roman period writer. His name's Dio Chrysostom. Lives in the 300 CE, or the 200. But anyway, Dio Chrysostom is a little bit complicated because their names are similar, but just bear with me. So Dio Chrysostom tells us the story of an earlier philosopher, much more famous, named Diogenes. Diogenes, the Cynic philosopher, quite famously lived like a dog, and he hung out in Corinth, which was very close by for several months. Diogenes visited the Isthmian Games, and he's supposed to have given several speeches there and lessons about how crowds of wretched sophists, or Chrysostom, crowds of wretched sophists would gather around the temple of Poseidon, arguing with one another, while writers read aloud from their compositions, poets recited their poems to occasional applause, and jugglers, fortune tellers, lawyers, and peddlers offered their services, advertised their wares. And Dio tells the story that the winner of the one stad race, the one shortest, the most exciting of the races for running, was being carried off through the crowd, and people were throwing flowers, congratulations, and applause. Diogenes had been critical. He says, no, it's about training your mind, not your body. He was quite down on the games as an idea. And we have this conversation that Diogenes points out to the winning runner, who barely won by one stride. And the runner shot back. That's what makes the victory so wondrous. I barely won, right? Like, it could have gone either way, and it went my way. And this is surely fictionalized from the Roman period, talking about an early Greek, but it definitely shows the compelling, this atmosphere of festival. I want to say festival atmosphere. So how have we done on our questions so far? What were the crown games? What types of things happened at the games? And how closely does that match what we think of when we hear Olympic Games in the modern context, right? They're pretty different, the ancient from the modern, excluding women, holding musical competitions at Delphi, fighting battles in the sanctuary at Nemea, and raving cynic philosophers is not really what we think of in the modern Olympic movement. But on the other hand, I want to just put it out there that this idea of a peaceful and better world is not entirely absent in the ancient mindset, because these crown game sites are Panhellenic. It means all Greeks are welcome there, and it's a place where Greeks could come from all over their world to meet, to negotiate, to engage in diplomacy. It's in Isthmia where the Greeks met to devise their strategy for dealing with the Persian invasion in 480. The oracle at Delphi that offered advice to the Greeks for how to defeat the Persians, and there are loads of additional examples. And so this Greek world, the Greeks fought each other nonstop. The idea, brief moments of unity or aberration, but the crown games offered moments of unity and cooperation. They lasted for hundreds of years. It also seems like the games were somewhat of a social level up, right? There's a story, there's a Greek named Dionysius the First, ruler of a big chunk of the island of Sicily. He was very successful, and this is after the Peloponnesian War in the 300s BC. He seized power in Syracuse, and Dionysius consolidated his power over much of Sicily and chunks of the Italian mainland, and surrounded himself with athletes, artists, and intellectual court. Plato is supposed to have been during this time, right? And Dionysius wanted Olympic glory. And the way most rich people did this in ancient times is they entered the equestrian events. Dionysius wasn't able to go himself. He was fighting a war. He sent several teams of horses to Olympia to compete. This is in 388. The horses are decked out in expensive gear and finery and trapping. They had fancy tents set up and hired professional poetic reciters called rhapsodes. Hired them to perform poetry that Dionysius the First had composed. And so the rhapsodes started, performing Dionysius' poems. And initially there was a big crowd because guys were great and they're professional reciters. But eventually the crowd realized these poems were not very good. They were quite poor in quality. They began to boo and harass the performers. Some people in the crowd were so unruly that they tore down and plundered the entourage's tents. Dionysius' bad luck did not end. Teams of chariots wrecked during the race, and the ship sank on its way back from Olympia. In the end, I suppose, the glory of the Crown Games can't be bought, had to be earned. Crown Games ended in the 4th century CE with the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, right? And they don't end all at once, but as the empire and part of the Roman Empire, the empire focuses on Christianity, the festivals, the temples, the sacrifices, ancient gods shut down. Sacrificial fires were extinguished, the temples were closed, looters took the statues, treasures, sanctuaries fell into disrepair. The memory of the Crown Games faded. In later years, occasionally Europeans would try to revive the ideas of ancient Olympia. There are different examples of, let's try the Olympic Games again throughout, I guess we would say, the Renaissance and the early modern period. But this is pretty different from Panhellenic circuit of Isthmian, Nemea, Delphi, and Olympia. Indeed, starting in 1896 in Athens, we have what we consider the modern Olympic movement, but only once since then has the Olympic festival returned to Greece. So today, the idea of the Olympics is divorced from Greece, for more or less from a geographic location. Of course, there are ideals of Greece throughout. Today, visitors to ancient Olympia sense the importance of the site, and they converse in reverent tones, almost whispers, as they wander around toppled columns, foundation stones. Ironic, if you ask me, since it must have been loud, right, and raucous as people cheered. Delphi still welcomes busloads of pilgrims seeking the navel of the ancient world and seat of Apollo there in Parnassus. But relatively few visitors exert the effort to climb all the way to the stadium, clear to the top of the sanctuary. The site at Nemea, pretty much only Greek school kids on field trips visit there. But even during the Roman Empire, it was mostly abandoned, and the site became Argos. Isthmia is nestled along a quiet stretch of shoreline. This breeze rustling through the pine trees hardly compares to the din and the clamor associated with the ranting philosophers like about Diogenes, Cynic. The temples and treasuries lie in ruins. They're barely more than foundations. Most of the myriad victory statues, inscriptions, dedications have been taken away, broken, buried, or otherwise lost. It's difficult for visitors today to imagine the solemnity of the sacrifices, the pounding excitement of galloping horses in the hippodrome, haunting musical performances in Delphi, the crunch of a hardened fist landing on another boxer's nose, the breathless sprinting of pentathletes, and the roar of the crowd as the crown games winner, crowned and won his glory. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. Thank you. I don't know if you want to moderate, but we have time for questions or anything else you'd like to go over. If you don't.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for your talk. I was wondering just the climate emergency and all the fires going on in Greece, if there's kind of extra urgency to like exploring sites. And I wonder if there's, if you notice it's an effort to like catalog as much as we can, to learn as much as we can, but a lot of less accessible, especially, potentially.
Sure, that's a good question. Yeah, if we are racing, I wish we were doing more. It's extremely expensive to do archaeological excavations anywhere. I've done archaeology myself, but not in Greece. There are people working, however, on all 4 of these sites right now. As sometimes, and I don't know enough about individual sites, people running them, but I do have the impression that sometimes the interests of the leading archaeologists dictate where they're going to dig that year. So there are definitely people working on all of these. They're just so enormous and gigantic. And there are fires in Greece. They're in the midst of a massive, deep drought and over tourism. And you might have been following this in the news a little bit. Greece is starting to limit who can visit. So I think that's a good point of the treasures are already kind of wrecked and they might be gone forever at some point. So there probably isn't a sense of urgency. This is just my impression that should have, but on the other side of it, I think kind of a common aphorism I hear in archaeology is people today are more important than people of long ago, right? Like a lot of the resources, fire mitigation, for example, at Isthmia and at Delphi, there's a lot of resources going into making sure they have, they're cutting away areas that are close to houses, right? That could burn, right? If this ancient site gets fired, that is horrible and tragic, but people who live here prioritize well. So there's definitely attention going into there, but I don't know. We'll see how Greece handles it. It's also just, in some ways, it's great because our imaginations are so much more ripe than the sites could convey. But on the other hand, it is. You saw these pictures, right? And I'm like, I promise you, this was amazing once. And you're like, that's 3 rocks. Like, what's going on? Like this is what I take students and I go, these columns are probably a solid half mile away from where they originated. Well, where they originated is rocks, I don't know, but where they were in a temple, because at one time in the 5th century, many of the temples at Isthmia were dismantled to build a wall. It's called the Hexamilion Wall, which means the 6-mile long wall to keep out they call them the barbarians, right? The Herodians were coming from the north to invade. And so they took everything down and built a wall. So on the one hand, you're like, it's too bad they ruined the sanctuary. But on the other hand, they managed to not get wiped out by the Herodians. So I think that's a very good question. And it's just an ongoing kind of trade-off of our resources, I think.
Your first picture showed the 5 rings that we associate with the Olympic Games now. Was that then a symbol of the Olympic Games? Was that an ancient symbol? Obviously, but.
No, not obvious at all. So thank you for that question. It's a little bit of a wink, right? This is the modern games, and I'm not going to say anything bad about the modern games. They've done some great things for the world, but in some ways they make it harder to study the ancient. Want to find elements of ancient modern ones. It's kind of the other way around, I suppose. This is an altar there's a little grove, like a memorial grove to Pierre de Coubertin. who was the, I guess we'll say, the architect of the modern Olympic movement. He had lots of help, but after he died, I'm just going to tell the story, draw what you do, but he asked that his heart be removed from his body and taken to Greece and buried. And it's buried next to this altar. And there's a big monument. And so this altar is known as like my way high, sculpted on here. The rings were devised by Pierre de Coubertin. The story is that when they're colored in, they're supposed to symbolize, they have an element of every national flag color in the world. There's a more sort of subversive racial legend that goes with it about different continents, counting the Americas as one continent, and racist stereotypes about that. That I don't want to say that's been disproven, but most people reject it. First off, is a bad idea anyway. Like, let's go ahead and say racism is a bad idea. I'm going out on a limb there, right? But there just doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence that was Pierre de Coubertin's intention. Maybe it is. You could. I'm not going to invite you to go Google racist on the internet, but the rings were devised in the early 20th century, but then carved into this monument to look old. So it is a way of making the modern games look like a extension. And there are several examples from the modern Olympic Games, especially those of the late 19th, early 20th century. There's this great sign, these banners that they hung in Athens. And they said, the modern Olympic Games, 776 BC to 1896, right? Like, hasn't stopped, hasn't changed. Never mind that the ancient Olympic Games, by definition, are held in Olympia, because that's the play. Otherwise, they're just called games, right? Like, but they really wanted to connect it to this time. So yeah, thanks for asking about that. It is a little bit of ancient origins, but I like this image because it shows a little bit of this interplay between what is ancient, what is modern, what is a modern version of ancients, and then the crack through there. You'll see this in a lot of publications. The Olympic movement isn't as pure as it wants to. None of us is, right? But there's definitely some cracks in the modern Olympic. Thanks for that question.
So you've talked a little bit about the other types of competitions that were going on in these different games, about the music competitions and the speed game and whatever else. Why do you think none of those have been revived in the same way as the athletic competitions have been, other than just maybe not quite as flashy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, I have this conversation with my students all the time. I would love to see horse racing at the Olympic Games, right? Like chariot racing. How great would that be? And I don't want to say anything mean about it, but dressage is not heart-pounding exciting in the same, the dancing horses are fantastic, but not in the same way as like coming down the stretch, right? So I don't know exactly why, other than I can tell you what the ancients believe and what the moderns believe. So, I often take grief from my students. They'll say, you don't know anything. I'm like, I know, I only know the information, and I invite people to draw their own conclusions, right? But in ancient times, there was the Roman period. I guess we would call him a travel writer. He went around Greece. His name's Pausanias. I quoted him a couple times in here. But Pausanias went around and he wrote down what he saw. And he spent, he has 10 books in his description of Greece. 2 of them are on Olympia. And 1 of them is on Delphi. So, 3 of the 10, 30% more or less on 2 of the Crown Game sites. And the other ones show up in briefer form. And he says when he gets to Delphi, he says there are a lot of monuments to musical victors. But nobody really cares about that. So I'm not going to tell you about it. And I'm kind of interested in it, right? I think it's a cool idea. I'm not very musical, but I think it's worthwhile, but it kills me. I'm like, why don't we know more? So even in ancient times, there was this stigma of, well, that's a musical event. Nevertheless, you could win. You could put up a victory monument. You got stuff named after you. We have statues, some of them. We have some names. We have some sources, but not nearly enough. Modern, I guess we'll say theory, or people who study athletics and competitions, they have suggested that it's too difficult to judge musical competitions. I'm not sure that's the answer, because I think it's pretty hard to judge gymnastics. but I'm not a gymnast, but I imagine musician has similar training. But that is one of the theories that it's too difficult to judge musical competition. That's why I like the Pythia Nomos, where they all play the same song, and then maybe that would be a little different. In early modern Olympic times, there used to, in the 19 teens, 20s, even up through the 30s, there were art competitions. And I really only know this because I live in Utah, right? And Utah had an Olympic art champion in 1932, Los Angeles Games. His name's Mahanrai Young, and he sculpted this. No, it's in the Smithsonian now. It's a bronze sculpture of a boxer just punched another boxer who was on the ground. I think it's called the knockout, right? And so, Utah's very proud of this because they go, hey, look, we won we had an Olympic champion in art, right? They, very quietly, right? Olympic champions in art, right? So this ended with World War II, and they had to scale back the competitions. And now there's always a cultural festival that goes with the Olympics that showcases artistic and other other kind of cultural achievements, but they're not judged. I think it could be kind of cool to bring it back, but it probably is hard to judge something like art and music. If you run the race, the first person across the finish line is the winner, right? We don't really have judged events in the ancient games. There are examples of ties, right? They don't have photo replay, and we have some cool sources about how they determined the winner of a very, very close race where I couldn't tell the difference. They would ask the gods to decide by casting lots, which is kind of weird, but also kind of awesome. So I know I'm wandering from the question, but it's a really good question about why do people like some things and not other things? And it has, maybe there's an inherent trait in there, maybe it's something we've inherited, but either way, in ancient sources and in modern, that the artistic games, right, call them out, the musical games, are not nearly as popular in ancient times as modern competition. Sorry, it's the gymnastic competition. I'm talking all over. I better take a drink.
It's kind of a similar question, but 900 years is a really long time. How often did they add new events or new games? I just kind of think like it'd be fun to think what the ancient Greeks would think of breakdancing.
No, I didn't want to cut you off. Is that?
No, that's it. Yeah, I was
Okay.
just wondering if they added stuff regularly or if it was like a big to-do.
Yeah, no, they would. And we have the same source Pausanias tells us. So the original or the first ancient Olympic festival only has, remember, it's a religious festival, right? There's a bunch of sacrifices, procession, presumably prayers that go along with it, maybe other rituals that don't have, material record of, but something they said or something they thought. But the original games part was only the one stadium race. That's it. Right, for a long time. And then somebody got the idea, well, what if we had two races, right? And, that part got more popular. Over time, we read about, they added things in. And we also have stories of things being taken out because it became less popular. They used to have at Olympia, and I'm not going to lie, I would love to see this one too. It was a mule cart race. So you'd hook up your cart to a mule, and then, it was a race to the finish line. I've never ridden a mule, but I've ridden a donkey, and it was much different from a horse. It's really challenging. And it didn't do anything I asked it to. So maybe that was part of it, right? So they would experiment with these kinds of things. And in the end, this is one of the questions. One of the great contradictions of ancient Greek athletics in these festival contexts is you're honoring the gods, right? The whole premise here is to honor Zeus at Olympia, Zeus at Nemea, Apollo at Delphi or Poseidon at Isthmia. You're also honoring yourself if you're the winner, right? You're going to put a statue up, you're going to put yourself in this statue, talk about how great you are. You're better than any mortal. You're a straight fighting mighty man like Diagoras. And you got to be humble, but you got to brag at the same time. This fine line of it. And so if we take it as the idea of you're doing things to honor the gods, if the event isn't very popular or somehow sullies the dignity of the games, it seems to me it would have dropped out. Over time, the program gets longer, right? They add more things in. But I don't know. I think Greece essentially is a conservative society in ancient times. I know that word is loaded today, but ancient times it was better have a reason to change it, but they would add things to the program. We do have an example of things being taken out. One of the sort of notorious stories of the Olympic Games, Nero visited in the 60s of the Common Era. Nero, the emperor, visits Olympia and he says, well, it's time for the Olympic Games. And they said, it's not the right year. And he said, I'm Nero, the emperor, it is. And they go, oh, yeah, you're right. But there's this thing. So they held the games and Nero won them all. Right? He's the greatest Olympic champion of all time, Nero. And they tell us the source, this is the same source, Pausanias, but it pops up in a couple other places. They tell us that Nero decided to introduce the 10-horse chariot race, right? And it's really hard, I imagine, to control 10 horses at once. And we read that Nero fell out of his cart, like his cart tipped over. And the source is great because it says he had to be put back in. Not he got back in, but he had to be put back in, right? Like he couldn't do it himself. And so that one didn't make it to the permanent program. So it's hard to wonder, or it's not hard to wonder, it's easy to wonder, but it's hard for me to understand, like, how does me running really fast honor the gods, right? Like, that's different, similar, but it kind of makes sense to me. It kind of doesn't. There's an interesting, it's kind of anthropological explanation, and I don't know if it's correct or right or whatever the right word is, but I like to think about it. It's a guy named David Sansone, and he said, think of athletics in ancient times anyway, maybe today, but as a ritual sacrifice of energy, right? And energy, I mean, to me, it's like, oh, I need some energy. I can get snacks anywhere. But in ancient times, especially we're talking, before, long, long ago, it's hard to get energy, right? You have to work really hard for your food. And I'm going to give up some of that to honor the gods by running hard or wrestling or throwing something. And maybe that does make it a little more solemn. But as to why the Greeks liked what they liked or didn't like what they didn't like, why these events would come and go, I don't know exactly, but they might have been into breakdancing. They definitely had at Athens, Panhellenic had dancing as a competition. They had a dance. It was I always think of like those boy bands, like NSYNC, right? It was like male only. It's called the Makoma, like a warrior dance. They also had the good looking man contest. It was a dance. So they probably would have been open-minded to it, but maybe not at Olympia.
All right, we've got one more question and then we'll probably end it.
Thank you very much for your talk. Clearly Olympics was the event or by men, for men, or for the gods. But I would like to ask so beyond the laureates and so on, where were these people staying? Who was providing food for them, accommodation, lodging, everything that kind of happens not on the stadium, but really around it in surrounding areas. And what I would like to ask for is kind of, is there an invisible layer in which women, children, and other community members would be involved in this activity, or was it really all men show run for the men and the gods? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. Thank you. So there's a really good, I guess we'll say, article by a scholar, because I love this actor. His name's Matthew Dillon. Not the same person, the scholar. But Matthew Dillon wrote this article, and I'm very persuaded by it, about girls, and I mean that term quite literally, right? These are younger females, girls being allowed to attend the Olympic Games with their fathers or their brothers. And Greece is a very, very patriarchal, androcentric society. I don't have to, I say this to my students, I'm like, I don't like it, but it's how it was. I don't want to pretend it wasn't that way. So there is evidence that females are allowed to go and to witness the games. There are definitely lots of women involved in the sanctuary or in the nearby areas. They're just not allowed to watch the games. So probably not the main sacrifice either. It's hard to know exactly where they would have drawn the line or the border, but these are large areas, and we do have these buildings, right? Like that are made kind of like a hotel for VIPs. Everybody else would be camping, and presumably they would have to bring their support staff or waiters or people selling stuff. So my inclination, and there just aren't sources. I really want ancient Greeks to say, you know what, let's write down a bunch of stuff about women real quick. And they didn't so far. Maybe it's in the desert or on a description somewhere. But our understanding is, there were people selling food, firewood, souvenirs. Of course, there would be women involved in this. It's just, they're invisible to us right now in the sources. We just don't have it other than these exceptional stories like Calyptera, right? This woman who sneaks in. But in general, there would have been a considerable number of women, girls, wandering around, especially if girls indeed are allowed to attend the games. And for sure, in the larger entourage that would be outside the area of the games, encampments, temporary. The games are only lasting about 4 or 5 days for the program, so a brief amount of time. But there definitely is an entire class of people in Greece supporting the great ideas. And this is something worth remembering, right? Athenian democracy is possible because so many people are enslaved working to allow the citizens to take the day off. Right? Like there's just a lot of unpaid labor that built these important institutions on. And it's worth remembering and acknowledging that. Thank you for the question. Thank you so much. You guys are great questions. I'm working on my model. Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know. I'm not talking into it. Sure. Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah. Yeah, probably that. Okay. Okay. Well, it's on the screen too, but yeah. Right. If it wasn't, would you tell me? Would you?